Now, councils in England which delay or block housing developments for no good reason will be named and shamed. The Housing Minister, Michael Gove, said that in extreme cases, councils could even be stripped of their planning powers in a bid to get Britain building.
Rigorous inspection, robust league tables. I will apply the same principles and approach to the performance of local planning authorities. We will publish league tables revealing the real performance of local planning authorities, the speed with which they respond, the level of approvals, their delivery against targets. We will ensure that these league tables reflect how the system is gained at the moment by some.
League tables, eh? Our political correspondent, Alicia Fitzgerald, was at the speech earlier today, and here's what she made of it.
Michael Gove has today given a speech to outline plans for house building. He says this will be the first of many new plans to show that the Conservative Party are on the side of the builders, not the blockers. A bit of context about this is that the Conservative Party for a while had really ambitious house building targets. These came under pressure to be watered down by what we call the NIMBYs, that is the not in my backyarders, who all said that protecting our countryside and making sure that there is substantial infrastructure in some of the more rural areas to support a bigger population is the most important thing. This speech definitely was about striking balance. Michael Gove said that this was about sensitive adjustment to the plans rather than abandonment, but you could definitely see that he was pandering to the side of the NIMBY pressure. He unleashed a few new announcements today, the first of which is that the councils will be able to be more heavily scrutinised by the government. He said that all councils must have suitable planning proposals and show the government that they have plans to increase their house building. He also said that if they don't keep up with this and if their plans are not suitable, he will personally intervene. Bit of a threat. And lastly, and this was the most controversial of all of the announcements, was that he is actually giving councils the power to water down their house building targets. That is obviously going to be a bit divisive, considering he was trying to say that the party are on the side of the builders, not the blockers. But what he was saying here is that if a certain area or a certain council have reason to say that building these houses would cause negative impacts to the environment, building on the green belt, for example, they must provide ample evidence to the government to say why these houses can't be built, and this will be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So the overall ethos of the speech was definitely Michael Gove trying to please both sides here and strike a balance between knowing that we need more houses, but also making sure that our countryside stays intact and that everyone's happy.
So not particularly exciting, not particularly innovative, and probably isn't going to happen. Apart from that, brilliant. To discuss this, I'm joined by property expert Mr. Russell Quirk. Russell, very good evening to you. Welcome to the new improved independent Republic of Mike Graham in under dark times.
Good evening, good evening.
I said at the start of the show, what are we going to do to fix Britain? Well, I mean, you could build a lot more houses and that might help because it might, stimulate the economy locally and nationally. It might give money to people who need the work. It might give money to companies that need the income. And it might actually improve the living conditions for an awful lot of people who don't have any houses. But nobody really believes that anything that Michael Gove said today is going to happen, do they?
Well, no, unfortunately, because we have heard it all before, and we've heard the same rhetoric from multiple different secretaries of state, multiple prime ministers and housing ministers, going back really, Mike, until the 1960s. We haven't built enough houses in this country since the days of Macmillan. We need 300,000 a year. The Conservatives, of course, have rowed back on that as a target, although Michael Gove did mention it coming back today, but didn't formalise it. And we deliver about 200,000. So there's about 100,000 homes per annum deficit. The speech, though, today, Mike, from Michael Gove was rather schizophrenic, I thought. I mean, on the one hand, he's saying, I'm going to punish councils if they don't play ball, even though a lot of the stuff he talked about is already in place. They already have 5-year plans. They are already scrutinised in terms of performance. So it was pretty mealy-mouthed in that respect. But Alicia's dead right. This whole kind of green belt running back thing, which is to appease the likes of Theresa Villiers, who famously a few months ago said, I'm going to put together a backbench rebellion, another one, of 60 Conservative MPs, if you make us accept more housing in our constituencies, because we think that we might get voted out as a consequence. Well, Theresa and others, I've got news for you. You're going to get voted out anyway, so it doesn't matter. The problem is, Mike, and sorry, I'm on a little rant here. Give me a little rest, mate. The problem is, it's not an issue of planning that is the problem with UK house building. There are currently 1 million unfulfilled planning permissions in Britain. So in other words, 1 million planning permissions that have been consented where the developers have not built the houses. So the problem isn't planning, the problem is the builders not wanting to build where and when society wants and needs them to.
Okay. See, that comes as a surprise to me because I was always under the impression that planning was the sort of hold-up, was the bottleneck, because I don't know anyone who's tried to do anything that involved the planning department of a local council who hasn't had it held up by that local council, sometimes to a ridiculous degree. But you're saying that's actually not the big problem.
It's definitely, you're right, it's definitely a part of the problem. Council planning departments are awful. I mean, that they are mired in the treacle of bureaucracy. They are incredibly inefficient and actually overtly political, because where, as I just referenced, MPs get concerned about big developments in their constituencies not being wanted by the constituents, it's even worse when it comes to smaller developments and guns being held to the heads of local councillors by residents. So yeah, the planning system is an absolute quagmire of inefficiency. It's a mess, but it is definitely not the biggest problem. The problem is we don't really have any longer what we call SME builders. You know, the small grafting builder that builds 10 houses a year, 20 houses a year, and does a very, very good job and takes pride in that job. 80% of houses now are delivered by just 10 massive PLC house builders, some of which, by the way, are also donors to the Conservative Party, of course, join the dots. And that is why we're at the behest of their shareholders deciding what is built where and when, rather than it being a question of us having those houses built, on a regular basis, year on year, no matter what.
Right. And so what is the answer? Because we're trying to get some answers tonight about how to fix Britain. I mean, you've been in the business a long time, Russell. What should they be saying? What should they be suggesting?
So the last people that we want dealing with the problem of housing supply is politicians, because I think they've proved over the last 30 or 40 years that they are completely incompetent when it comes to the delivery of housing. They simply play political football with the subject. What we need to do is to set up something that is kind of run like a private sector business, but of course owned by the public, as in shareholders, but that's given a long-term mandate in terms of what needs to be built where and when, and simply left to get on with it. I mean, outside the realms of housing ministers meddling on a day-to-day basis, outside the realms of Parliament, whereby there's a mandate given, let's say on a 10-year basis, across the country for effectively a board of directors with one job, and that is to deliver houses across the country where they're needed. And what I mean by that is not just the houses that we all want to buy, but of course the implications on lack of housing supply, Mike, are that we've got an incredibly dangerous kind of social housing crisis where there's about 1 million people now on the housing waiting list, because social housing is indelibly linked to the delivery of housing overall. So take it out of the hands of politicians, give a bunch of people that know the industry a mandate and let them get on with it. In other words, politicians need to get out of the way.
Yes. But in terms of social housing, we also know an awful lot of social housing is now taken up by people who have come here from other countries. And while it doesn't necessarily affect the whole of Britain, certainly in the London area, it's almost 50% of the social housing. And only yesterday, I was reporting on this new net zero sort of crusade where they're giving something like 6 billion quid as a grant to various homes to put heat pumps in, and much of that will go on into social housing. You're kind of going, well, surely you should spend that money building houses, shouldn't you?
Building houses instead. And of course, the answer was supposed to be the introduction of housing associations a few years ago. There's about 1,000 of those now. But of course, most of those with their highly paid chief executives are now actually building as many houses for sale as they are for social rent and shared ownership, because they want to they want to shore up their own coffers. What we actually need to get back to, and I can't believe I'm saying this as a Conservative, but is the good old days of building council houses. The problem is councils now don't know how to build houses. We used to build 300,000 of those a year. I mean, back in Macmillan's day. Now we barely build 3,000 council houses a year. That's the problem. And that actually is probably the only thing in housing, in my opinion, that should be left to a kind of political dynamic. In other words, if a local council doesn't build enough council houses, they get voted out.
Yeah. Absolutely. Russell, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Russell Quirk there with a couple of answers as to what they could be doing about housing.